phrasing matters a lot, right? If you're like, oh, abortion should be legal in most cases versus illegal in most cases, or if you say abortion should be legal in most cases, or then you say it should be illegal occasionally, you're going to get two different responses to those questions, despite like them essentially saying the same thing, right?
Hey y'all, welcome to the Texas Forward podcast. Today's episode is our first Volunteer Spotlight edition, featuring Alex Paluch. Alex is canvassed with our Austin-based street teams, currently serves as the admin of the Discord server, and spent several years working for a large political consulting firm before getting involved with the Forward Party. Your host, Brian Lee, speaks with Alex about what it's like knocking on doors and canvassing for a political campaign, and how the two major parties use voter data. Alex also touches on the infrastructure needed to build a political party like Forward. Thanks so much for listening. If you have a friend that might also enjoy the Texas Forward podcast, please don't hesitate to forward this episode along. We can't do this without you, and we appreciate your support. We hope you enjoy today's Volunteer Spotlight, and as always, don't forget to like and subscribe.
Alex Paluch, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, it's great to have you. Everybody listening at home, this is the Texas Forward podcast. I am your host, Brian Lee. Super excited to talk to Alex today. He is a very active and has been a very active Forward Party volunteer since the beginning, and we'll get into his accomplishments, not least of which was saving the Discord server from destruction. He's a folk hero in our community. Not an understatement. Not an understatement, but also, really interesting background. You spent about a year and a half working for one of the largest political consulting firms in the country.
Yeah, in Texas.
In Texas.
So yeah, they are in Texas. So yeah, that's correct. So I originally got hooked up with them. For a long story I'm going to avoid, but was unemployed at the start of COVID. I needed a job. And so I worked at an Amazon warehouse, but I was like, I don't want to do this for the rest of my life, and was looking for career options. And I had a friend from college who was into politics, and he had always been like, hey man, like if you need a job, give me a call. I can get you a job. And so the one day I called him up and I was like, hey man, I'm calling in that favor. Like I'm looking for a job. And so within, I think like 2 weeks, I was down in Florida knocking on a congressional race. It was a primary. And I was there for 2 weeks. They moved us up to Illinois to work on a project there. I was in Chicago for probably 2-3 weeks. They moved me down to East St. Louis, so still in Illinois, but did that for a few weeks. Eventually came down to Texas, ran the grassroots team for a city council race in Dallas, and then they brought me on internally because I was really tired of driving cross country.
Well, you must have been doing a good job then.
Yeah, no, they liked me. It was and I mean, like, I will say of, the like going door to door, which is what I was doing. I was doing professional grassroots. So, you just walk down the street, you knock on a door. If they're not home, you leave like a little flyer. And if they are home, you have a tablet, you fill out some questions, talk to them for, max 5 minutes. If you're spending 5 minutes at a door, it's probably too long.
Yeah.
And then you go to the next door. So that was how I started with the company. And we can get into all the details of that. And then I moved into my background in school was actually, I did aerospace and mechanical engineering. So completely different from politics, but they took me on internally because they were like, technology, something, fill in the blank. Like, we need a guy who does data analytics, and we can't pay what an actual data analyst salary requires, so we're going to hire you and train you up, which is, I mean, a great deal. They don't pay you, awful, but they don't pay you well. But I mean, you get free experience, so I would
learn it on the job.
Recommend. Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. Yep. Okay, so tell us more then about the company itself. So this organization, I mean, you didn't live in Florida at the time when you started working for these guys.
I'm from Buffalo, New York. I moved to Austin for the job when they took me on internally. Okay. So yeah, I drove from Buffalo all the way to like the far west coast of Florida, and then up to Chicago within like the span of a month. It was quite an experience. But
You were
yeah,
just going neighborhood to neighborhood, or like what? Walk me
yeah,
through what was that like? They just give you a map and they say these are your doors and you got to
yeah.
knock on them. And
So
did you have a quota, or like what was the process?
yeah, so in the beginning, it's pretty point and shoot. You have someone on the ground there with you who you text with mostly, and they're the person who gives you, the campaign literature, any like flyers or door hangers. And our requirement was typically 120 doors a day, so you're doing full time. Typically, you can knock it out in 6 hours if you have like a decent walking pace, and it's not. It depends on density. So, like if you're in a suburban neighborhood versus a rural area, you're not hitting 120 doors a day in a rural area. Like it's just not
Right.
happening. But and normally most of those people get targeted by mail. You're not going to go knock doors out in like podunk nowhere. If it's an actual town, maybe if it's big enough. But even then, someone's got to drive there.
Yeah.
So, and
It's just
that
not
you're
efficient.
paying, yeah, it's just not efficient. And when you're doing like professional paid grassroots, every, dollars for minutes kind of thing. So you reach people who are in rural communities more with mail, whereas suburban, and to a lesser degree, urban, you're going to reach with grassroots. Urban has the problem that like most people live in apartments or something like that.
Yeah. You got to get
And
past the gate.
well, not only that, but this is like if anyone's ever knocking for forward, this is relevant. Um, if people who live in apartments usually live there 1 year, right?
Yeah.
Like
Sure.
that's the median. And so the people who are in that district very well might not be in that district next time the cycle comes around. They might have moved 2, 3 times. So it's very hard to do targeting when everyone moves like that. Whereas if someone's in a suburban neighborhood and they bought a home there, they're probably going to be there 10, 20, 30 years.
Definitely.
And so much, much easier to target.
Interesting nuance you don't think about. So,
Yeah.
so yeah, I'm curious. So this is a company that basically tell me more about what the company does. This is
company.
like the brains behind political campaigns. Like tell me more about them.
Yeah. So if you were like, hey, I want to run for office, how do I do that? I mean, there's obviously you can sort of like bootstrap your own campaign, which some people totally do, especially, if you're in the industry and you know people,
Yeah.
you can do that. And you're always going to have someone who's like a chief of staff or something, usually. You have the candidate and you have their chief of staff who's handling, booking all their events and stuff while you're on the phone asking for money, which
Yeah.
is a lot of what your job is when you run for office
So
or
I've
knocking
heard.
doors, whatever it is. So, and then typically, if you don't know what you're doing, you will go find a political consulting firm like the one I worked for and say, hey, I want to, sometimes, you're like, I think I can do like all the grassroots stuff. I have a background in that maybe, but I don't know how to run my Facebook page, my Twitter. I don't know how to do mailing. I don't know, fill in the blank. And the company I worked for will do anything and everything. So, I mean, we did everything from mail to digital to grassroots. If you were like, I just want to run and I need someone to shepherd me through the process, you could come find our company and, you have to interview. So
Yeah.
the company interviews you and you interview the company. It's like a
Ah,
mutual thing almost. Technically, you're hiring us, but the company is not going to just take on anybody because, then they can't say, 80%, 90% of our candidates win.
yeah. They got to make sure that this person's, got a chance to win.
Yeah, got a
Yeah.
chance to win, and I mean, like, has money and is serious and isn't, Vermin Supreme or something.
Or Tiger King, Joe
Yeah,
Exotic.
or Tiger King, Joe Exotic. Yeah, exactly. So, and there's always like stipulations in the contract, right? For like, if you start committing felonies, they can drop you. And you're not
Mm,
getting your money back. Like, there's stuff like that, which almost never come up, but they are in there.
interesting.
But so that's, you would come to our company and say, I want XYZ or maybe all three. And then, you talk to us, we figure out, what your sort of budget is based on how much money you're going to self-fund, what you think you can fundraise, what we think we can get out of PACs, things like that. And then you build that budget out. And then that's where the ball really starts rolling on. They start designing mail. They start hiring people for grassroots. They start doing all the digital work. That's how it all works. So,
Man.
yeah.
So I've got a lot of questions based on that actually. So
Oh, I got
at
lots of
what
answers, hopefully.
Well, good. Well, good. At what point are you getting involved with this? So, I mean, like, is there a recommended time period? I'm sure there is, when somebody's, when it is the right time for a candidate to engage with a consulting firm like this. At what point are you was the company getting involved in races and just kind of doing that research? It sounds like there's a lot of like intel that they would need to gather on particular districts and all the ins and the outs, like the selling points, the candidate's platform, all that stuff.
Yeah. So it depends. In most, I probably can't say most, but a lot of what the company I worked for did was Texas State House races. So, you are sort of familiar with the districts because we're Texas based, right? And I mean, like they do change. We just had redistricting in 2020, 2021, COVID, whatnot, sort of screwed up the timeline. But
Sure.
even then, districts are pretty similar. So you have
Gotcha.
an idea of what the district looks like. You have an idea of who the incumbent is, because honestly, the incumbents don't change that often.
Right.
So, I mean, like there's sometimes where someone from a completely different state, is like, oh, hey, let's Montana say, you're just I want someone, you guys look like you do a good job. And I mean, we would do out of state stuff for quite a few, but mostly we stayed in Texas. So that was one of our strengths, is it's like the home turf,
I
right?
see.
So
As a candidate, then you're buying the expertise in the particular
exactly,
district or area that you want to run.
exactly.
I see.
And so, and I can't give you a perfect answer for like if you're the candidate when you should reach out, because I wasn't on the candidate side. I was on the but I mean, like you're gonna want a good amount of time. I'm sure it depends on what sort of race. I mean, if you're running a municipal race for city council or mayor, it's probably going to be a much shorter time span than if you're president.
Yeah.
So there probably isn't one answer, but yeah.
So what were you doing in Florida then? If it's mostly in Illinois, if it's mostly Texas,
So
what was that all about?
So those were indeed out of state. Most of their stuff is in Texas, but they had, so the one in Illinois was a state constitutional amendment that we worked on. And then like I said, the one in Florida was a congressional primary. The guy in Florida lost, but we won in Illinois.
Yeah.
So, you can't win them all. But I mean, they had connections with certain, PACs or candidates or what have you, based on their connections in Texas and elsewhere. And so I mean, like politics, if you get into politics, especially on the left or the right, politics is very like incestuous. Everybody knows everybody.
Yeah.
And so even once you get out of state, somebody probably knows somebody, at least a decent percentage of the time. And so, and the other thing is you run into problems. So for example, if you're the company that's mostly focused on Texas, we just had the midterms. There's not that much going on this year in terms of like, if you're trying to make money, right? I mean, people are running municipal elections, but they're not spending $2, $3, $4, $5 million on an election, usually running for mayor. And mayor is going to be the big one. You're going to get city council, you're going to get school districts. And I mean, my company did all of those, right? We did everything down from school board all the way up to like, we never ran anyone for president during my time, but they have historically. So
oh wow.
Yeah. So I mean, like really running the gambit. Because income is good, generally speaking, if you're a company.
Oh, that's why you're in business, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so you do reach outside the state, particularly in like, years where that makes sense financially, either because there's not that much going on in Texas or there's opportunities abroad and someone's offering
a big race or somebody knows somebody, and
exactly
it makes I see
exactly. So, and I don't know the details of like how they got involved in those races. I was low on the totem pole, guy on the ground at that point, but yeah.
So you said you're not involved, or you weren't involved on the candidate side. Which side were you involved in? Can you talk a little bit more about like once you actually got in there and they were like, all right, and I can't remember, forgive me if we talked about this before our conversation or after we started recording. But you came on board and you were interning essentially, and then they, switched you over to kind of the data analytics stuff.
Yeah.
So,
So
so tell me more about that. How did that start to take shape?
yeah. So interning's not quite the right term. I mean, I was paid the whole time. I was paid canvasser. So,
Okay. Oh, good.
and in case anyone's wondering, I'm sure somebody is. Typically, you would make. It was all contract. You're not getting hired for like a salary or like hourly positions to do
Contracting.
this.
That's what I meant to say.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I was a contractor. So, yeah, you make typically 3,500 to 4,000 a month, but I mean, like, you're on the road every day, going to different neighborhoods. And I mean, you're going place to place fairly frequently. So there's not a lot you can do in terms of, you never get to know anywhere. So mostly what contractors do is they like go out and drink.
Sure. Fair enough.
Or
It's a
something
stressful
like that.
job, man. You've been knocking
It
on
is.
doors all day. Gotta have a beer.
Yeah. And yeah, especially like you have a bad day where you get like a few bad neighborhoods and people are just screaming at you. Like, you're just
Yeah.
like, I'm gonna have a beer. But yeah, so I did that and then moved on down to Texas. And what I did internally at the company, so I worked in the grassroots department, although I did interact with the other departments, but technically I was in grassroots. And then technically my position was sort of like data going between grassroots, and they had an internal data department.
Okay.
So that was what I did. So but essentially, I told you, when you're like a canvasser, you go house to house, you put information in on the app, and then you hit enter and you go to the next house. On the other end of that app, getting all of that data was the data department, which then sort of grassroots, interfaces with, however you want to phrase that. And then I'm looking on the back end and I'm saying, okay, how many people support us? How many people oppose us? How many people are undecided? What issues do they care about? And it's all based on, the little survey on the tablet.
Yeah.
And the
Sounds
notes that you
interesting.
read in. But yeah, no. So that was, and there's like, typically, and this is going to be not that different from a business, I still do data analytics, but I work for a normal for-profit private company now.
Sure.
So you build like dashboards, which are essentially, if people don't know about data analytics, essentially, if someone was like, okay, I have all of this data and nobody wants to just look at a table. So you make a lot of really pretty graphs and you try to tell a story about what's going on.
Yeah.
Right. So that's sort of what I did for candidates. Politics in some ways is a solved problem if you're thinking about it as like a math problem. So like, what are the relevant metrics, right? For if you're running for office and you're like, what do I need to know about what people think? Well, you need to know if people are going to vote for you. You need to know sort of messaging questions. So like, what's important in the district? Do people care about the border? Do they care about guns? Do they care about abortion? Like what's making them vote one way or the other? What levers can you pull?
Yeah.
And then, do they care about endorsements? All of that sort of stuff. So I would make a dashboard essentially with a bunch of graphs and breakdowns of all that stuff for each candidate. But they're all pretty dang similar, right? It's all American politics. And so there wasn't a ton. This is one of the reasons it was good as an entry-level job. There's not a ton of differences. So a lot of it is like, you go in, you change the name of a variable from one campaign to a different campaign, and that's what you do. So I did a lot of that. That was my main thing that I kept up on. And then there's a lot of it was a fairly, in terms of people working there, not in terms of how many people they're working for, small company. So if something came up and they're like, hey, we need 100 doors knocked on this race because we promised, that campaign that we were going to hit 1,000 doors in, a week or whatever, that's a small scale example, but something like that. And they're like, and we're not going to hit that, right? We couldn't hire enough people, or they all got sick, or fill in the blank. Occasionally they would send me to do that. I picked up campaign literature more times than I can count. And then hiring
you had
people.
you had to basically like convince people that this candidate was, you're selling them in a sense, right?
It is. Yeah, it is. It is similar to sales. It is not quite the same as sales. The way
They already have their mind made up in a lot of these cases.
A lot of them, you're going to open the door and they're like, oh man, if you're running in a general election, they're going to be like, oh man, I vote Republican every time. And you're like, perfect. This is the date of the election. Go vote on that date, please.
Yeah.
Right. Because that's the one thing. Yeah. It's the number one thing you care about, right? Like if they don't vote, they're not of any use to you. So that's the the number one thing. But I've lost my train of thought. But yeah. So that's the general. Oh yes, what I was doing internally. So, and then yeah, just sort of the other data related thing that I did was data collection. So
Okay.
you go crazy, crazy, crazy. You have this election going on, election happens, and then you're done. Right.
Yeah.
So they have to tally up all the election results. Usually takes a week or two if you're lucky. The state, depending on the portion of the state, every county, for those who don't know, tallies up the election separately.
Right.
So
Oh, we've heard it. We always hear a lot about that these days in these election
yeah,
cycles.
where
all
they're
the
like,
mess that's
oh,
happening.
election fraud, election fraud. There's so yeah, you essentially, one of my jobs was to call the county and be like, hey, do you guys have like the results yet? Have you figured it out? And they're like, nope. It'll be 2 weeks. And so, you call like a week later and you do the same thing. And then like once it gets past a certain point, you call them like every day, sometimes multiple times a day, depending on the county. I will not name county names, but some of them are much better than others. And
Yeah,
I
I was
mean,
gonna
there's
say you probably had some problem child counties. I'm certain.
absolutely. And it's interesting. Some of them are the total like podunk nowhere counties where it's like one town. There's legally required 4 precincts in a county in Texas.
Mhm.
And there are multiple counties with just 4 precincts, right? So like
Yeah.
those ones tend to be, they're not going to put it online. You have to call and they'll email it to you, probably, hopefully in a file format that's decent.
Well, you can almost forgive that in a sense because one, maybe they just
Exactly.
don't have that many people working there.
For sure.
It's a slower pace,
Mhm.
being in a smaller town, just generally speaking. So
Absolutely. But there's a few major counties who have not great election departments, and you're just like, well, like what is going on? So, but yeah, so that was the other thing is, and like not just election results. That's the thing you call for probably most often, but also
Mhm.
voting locations. So, you'll go to a candidate's website and they'll have on their website, they're like, hey, this is election day. Here's a map with every voting location in the district, right? And I know Rick touched on this in his episode, but most places these days you can vote in any precinct.
Hmm.
Like if you live in Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, you can just vote anywhere in the county. They don't care.
Yeah.
Um, so
Seems like that's the way it should be.
yeah.
You know,
Now that you have like the technology, back in the day, I mean, it was all pen and paper. So it kind of
yeah.
made sense. Like you had a certain list of people at a certain precinct, but now everybody's got everything. So, who cares? But anyways, so you like, in order to get this information on the website of where all these voting precinct or, voting locations are, someone has to gather that. And that person was me.
Oh man.
So you would go on the website and then you have to, normally they post them in PDF format. And you had to just do data entry and just read through the entire PDF of every single voting location. And I mean, if there's 5 or 10, it's not too bad. But I mean, like Dallas has like 200.
Yeah.
So like sometimes it takes most of a work day to get through
Well,
one of those suckers.
I just remember like looking for my precinct recently in the last election. It's
Mhm.
painful to read through those lists just looking for one.
Yes.
It
Yes,
really
it
is.
is.
It's like, oh, there's just a lot here. Like,
Yeah, there are, I think Collin County is one of the better ones in terms of, being able to visualize it and like they have a map, but a lot of them are just, it's on a list someone photocopied one too many times and it's technically a PDF and it's like slightly tilted. There's a lot of those.
oh, God bless you for doing that.
Yeah. So, but that was my day-to-day job was either calling election departments, sort of putting out the small fires as necessary at the company, or doing the data analytics. Those were the 3 things I did.
Nice. So I'm sure some of these, as you mentioned, you alluded to this, some of these people were not exactly the nicest people. I'm sure plenty were very nice, but any experiences when you were knocking on doors that really stand out?
Yeah. So everybody has experiences knocking on doors that stand out. You can't walk around like neighborhoods for a couple months without just some crazy person appearing, or especially knocking on doors. Maybe you could just walk around a neighborhood, but you're going door to door. So mostly you're like day to day is for anyone who's like ever considered it, like it's not real scary. It's sometimes people tell you to get off their lawn, but like you leave and it's fine.
It's fine.
There are definitely some experience that are a little bit crazier. Definitely, like I said earlier, tends to be a bunch of drinking, so drinking culture generally. But as far as actual door to door, you will get someone at some point who's just like, I don't know, like if they woke up on the wrong side of the bed or they're just crazy. But I had a guy up when I was in Chicago, and I like knocked. He wasn't even home. This was the craziest part. So I'm just going down the street, car's parked, going down the street, knocking on doors. He's not home. Leave a flyer, and I go to the next house, and he pulls in, gets out of the car like with his son or whatever, and like looks at the flyer and like marches across the yard to come find me at the neighbor's house.
Oh man.
And is like, oh, like, are you putting these up? Like super pissed. And I'm like, yeah, sure. You sort of like, when they're really pissed, you're not really going to give the pitch for obvious reasons.
Right.
But I was like, yeah, I'm putting them up, election day is coming up, have a good one. And he's like, don't you ever come here again. Da, 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 da. And I'm like, okay, like I wasn't planning to. Later.
Don't live in the state. It's all right.
Yeah. And so he starts walking back, and I'm like, okay, whatever. So, look down at the tablet, fill out the house I'm at currently, didn't answer, start walking to the next house. And he's like, what did I tell you? And like chases me down the street to come find. And like, he's like a 6-foot guy, not a small guy. And I'm like, I'm almost 6 foot myself. So it's, it could have been worse.
Could have been a fair fight.
I could have been like a 5'3" woman. That would have been way worse. But, and the
you never know
like,
these days. People can train jujitsu.
It's true. That's true. And the son's like, Dad, can we like go inside or come on? And I just like walk back to my car. And he like follows me all the way back to my car, and I like close the door, and I drove around to the other side of the block and got out and kept knocking doors. But
wow, you kept knocking in the same neighborhood.
Yeah.
I would have called it a day, man. I don't know about you. I'd be like, I'll go back to this neighborhood maybe tomorrow.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the problems. So after I got to Chicago, the reason they moved me down to East St. Louis was they were like, hey, we need someone to do like the low level management. So I told you, when you start off, it's pretty point and shoot. They give you a few neighborhoods to knock a day. And they send you off, and they check in, and then they're like, oh, you're at this many doors, because they have the back end data system that I, worked on some, and they can see how many doors you've knocked. So if you've been in the field, quote unquote, for 6 hours and you've knocked 6 doors, they're going to be like, hey man, like, what's up? Or if you are in the field for 30 minutes and you knock 100 doors, they're also going to be like, yeah, that seems highly suspect, right?
Sure.
So they promoted me to the person who deals with all the other canvassers, who writes the lists and who makes sure, people aren't cheating, essentially.
Yeah.
Because if you're cheating, they're going to fire you, particularly because, you sort of have to guarantee the quality of the data for the campaign the firm is working for. So, yeah.
That's the job, right?
Yeah. So if you cheat, they will catch you and they will fire you. So just, I don't know. People
don't
like,
cheat if you're listening at home and you think this sounds like a quick way
and
to
you
make
think it
some
sounds
money.
like an easy job where you're like, well, I'll just get the tablet and sit in a Starbucks. That does not work. I'm not sure why people do that, but that's like, there's some crazy stories about like people just literally like sitting in a Starbucks parking lot and like not even pretending to walk down a street. So, you fill out door 1 and then you fill out door 2. No, they go like door 1 on like, Main Street, and then they jump all the way over to like 4th on Broadway, and you're like, dude, like you're not even trying to cheat. Right?
No, they're just not very smart. It doesn't sound
not very smart. So, and I will say the other thing about knocking doors, that's a pretty crazy thing, is the attrition rate is like enormous in terms of door knockers. So
people quitting.
Yeah, people quitting and people just not showing up. So like if you, call people up because you're trying to get together your team and you're like, hey, we need to knock 10,000 doors in the next 3 months. I'm going to need some people on the ground. And you call up, 5, 10, 20 people, probably 1/4 of those people will show up to the first day of work. And probably like 1/4 of those will be there after a month. So we're talking like an 1/8 of people make it.
Yeah. It's essentially, it's cold calling, right? It's knocking door to door. It's a tough job.
It's a little bit. So I did and was not great at sales, and it is way easier than sales. And this is the difference between sales and politics is if you are a salesman, you are going to push all the way up until they like kick you out of their house kind of thing, right? Because if you don't make the sale, you don't care, right? Maybe there's like some business you don't want them to give you a bad review, but mostly you don't care. Whereas in politics, you don't want to you want to push them enough to get them to tell you they're going to vote for your person. And you want to push them to actually go to the polls, but you also don't want to piss them off because they can actually vote for the other person. Whereas that can't happen in sales, right? Either you get the money or you don't in sales. It's not like they're going to like take money from you if you piss them off enough. So it's a little bit nicer. It's not quite as pushy. So if you're like, if you were like me and you're like, man, sales was apparently not quite my thing, but I feel like if I had some practice, maybe I could have gotten good at it, that kind of thing.
Yeah, you're not afraid to talk to people.
You're not
afraid to work hard.
If you like walking around outside, and you like talking to people, you could totally try canvassing. It might be for you, but it definitely has a little bit of a roving salesman vibe.
Definitely. So, it's interesting. You hear so much about data these days, and obviously you were in data analytics, still are in data analytics. I mean, they say data is the new oil. And, it's hard to argue that. And you think about, the Trump campaign, there's all sorts of stories about this company, Cambridge Analytica, that they worked with. And that was a huge reason that they were able to, kind of tap into these, the forgotten man and the kind of the, Rust Belt, Obama voters, and Obama's campaign as well did the same thing. And I mean, they did a fantastic job harnessing data. And, it seems like just with the speed of technology changing, that this is the only the beginning to the depth that this stuff is going to, eventually get to. Are there any innovations, from what you know of, that are like coming down the pipes in this industry that are, particularly exciting or interesting, in terms of data analytics and just this whole space in the political consulting?
Yeah. So it's interesting. So there's sort of two levels to the data. When I said earlier that like in some ways politics is a solved problem, what I'm referring to is when you talk to someone, you sort of know the questions you need to ask, right? But there is a question about who should you talk to in the first place. And that's the much harder question. So, they talk polling generally. So like my firm did not perform polls and like we weren't the people making the calls, but we wrote out, we were saying, these are who we want to be targeted. These are the questions you're going to ask if you get them on the phone. And I mean, sometimes they're pretty extensive, like 30 questions. Someone's just going to like cold call you and be like, hey, we're doing a poll for, this race. These are the people running, blah, blah, blah. Right. And they go through like a whole list of questions. And I mean, like, there's more like short polls. They call them brush fire polls, where it's just trying to get a feel for like where the race is. So typically you'll do one of these big polls at the beginning, get a grasp of all the people you are trying to get to vote for you. And then as it goes on, you do these smaller polls to get updates. Because if you put out, let's say you get this big poll in the beginning, you write a few pieces of mails and you go to some doors and your talking points. Let's say the issue they're all worried about is, I don't know, abortion. And you're like, okay, here's our messaging on abortion. This we think is going to move the polls. You don't know if it's moved the polls until you check, right? So you run these smaller polls, the brush fire polls. So that there's definitely some stuff coming down the pipeline in terms of, and this is general, this doesn't even just apply to my firm, but one of the things they found, which I'm sure probably many listeners will be familiar with, is that if you have to weight your sample, right? If you call random people on the phone, you're not going to get a perfectly representative sample of anything, right? Whether it's America or your Texas State House district, fill in the blank. Some people are more likely to pick up the phone than others. And the other thing is like, you want to match if you're calling a district, the district. So you can tell, it's public information, like who's registered to vote. So what percentage of the electorate's male, what percentage of the electorate's female, how they voted in past elections, because your voting history is also public record, not who you voted for, but what you voted
If you
in.
voted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you vote in a
If and where you
Republican
voted.
primary or a Democratic runoff, that is going to be recorded. And, they can, anyone can, a lot of the times they make you pay $50 or something for the trouble, but you can just call up your local election department and be like, hey, I want this information. That's maybe like one of the best resources if you're thinking about running for office, is you can just get the list of voters. Right. And then they have to have on their address, their residency, because they have to be in the district to vote.
Sure.
So if you're wanting to do mailing or grassroots, that's great. Telephones, a little bit harder. Those are not listed on your voter registration. So you have to like buy the data from someone. And I mean, there's whole firms that do that sell data, right?
Oh yeah.
So,
I mean, I'm a recruiter, and there's all types of companies where you can get people's phone number, email, all that stuff. I mean, countless different ways to
absolutely.
do that.
So,
Not that I would ever do that. All my phone numbers and emails are completely organic.
there you go. But yeah, so you have to weight these samples once you actually conduct one of these polls, and you weight it based on what you know about the district.
Sure.
And so you say, okay, we got a 58% response rate from women, but it's really it's 52% women in the district. So we're going to bring that down, and we're going to bring the men up. And there's a whole bunch of things you need to wait on, because if you don't, it's going to be inaccurate. There are things you don't need to wait on, right? So you probably couldn't do it anyways, but waiting on ice cream flavors isn't going to give you any relevant information, probably politically. But it turns out nowadays, waiting on education, so whether you went to high school or whether you got a 4-year degree or a master's or a PhD, is quite important.
Sure.
So that is something that they're all slowly trying to do. That data is in the census typically. So they're trying to get it that way, but it's sort of a long process and can be expensive just in man hours. So the bigger places do it. I know the data firm we were working with did indeed like offer that information, and we did wait on education, but some of the smaller ones don't, just because it's prohibitive. So, but that's one of the things coming down the pipeline. And I mean, like, they're on the lookout for other things to wait on. So the other one that no one has figured out how to do yet is people who are like, Trumpian Republican kind of people are less likely to pick up the phone, right? They're like more antisocial. Sure. And I don't mean that in a bad way. They're just, they're the kind of people who like live out in the middle of rural Kentucky or something and are just like, don't talk to me. I moved out here for a reason.
They're
and
not,
like,
no, they're not a chatty Cathy. Not gonna.
Yeah. And you're like, I mean, fair enough. That's not your thing, but or that it is your thing to live on a ranch in the middle of nowhere, but you're not likely to pick up the phone, but you are still going to vote. So they need to be able to weight the people that don't answer these polls, which is sort of like a catch-22, because you weren't talking to them because they're not picking up the phone. So you don't really have any data on them. And it's hard.
Is that there's clearly been a big problem with polling. If we're talking about Trump voters in 2016, they were, consistently wrong in almost every major poll. It seems like it's gotten slightly better, but I feel like that has to only be getting worse. I never answer my phone. I get spam calls all day, every day. And I feel like, even just generally speaking, I would imagine there's a lot of people who are answering their phone a lot less than they were 5 years ago. Younger generation for sure.
Yeah.
They're not going to answer a random number. It's just not worth it. Doesn't make sense with all the spam going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and the firms that do polling are working on like getting around this. So like in the old school back in, the 50s, 70s, 80s, whatever, they just called house phones. Basically everybody had a house phone and everybody picked up. There's no caller ID. So, but now everybody's got caller ID and it's all cell phones. And the other thing is like, it's, you can't auto dial cell phones. That's like a federal law. You can't do it. And so that is also prohibitive, because it's got to be someone like calling every time. It has to be a human being. So you have to pay for that. But they're getting much better at going through, MailChimp's sort of not quite
Email.
accurate example, but yeah, it's
It's an
MailChimp
email
is,
tool, right?
yeah, it's an email tool, and you'll do surveys. So they'll be like, hey, you are in this district. It's the same sort of thing. They're just sending it to you through an email and you're filling it out online instead of getting a call and doing it with a person. Generally, they still want like the in-person experience because you're more likely to fill that out. It's a little bit different of a response rate. It's
Absolutely.
more efficient in terms of how much you send out versus how much you get back. But they're getting much better at that. And that's one of the things that I think like 2016 was in that like prime window where the old system didn't work, but they hadn't quite figured out the new system.
Mm.
And so they've gotten better at that. And then, like I said, they've started, most of the really good polling firms have started waiting on education, which is a big factor. So, and I'm sure going to keep working at it. That's their job, and it'll get better. But yeah, that's sort of where that all stands.
I get it. That makes sense. And so what about, the social media companies, Facebook, Google? I mean, they know your preferences like better than you do in a lot of cases. You open these apps these days, scrolling on Instagram, and it's weird. I almost kind of like it. They're advertising me like a jacket that I didn't know, some company I've never heard of, and I'm like, that jacket is exactly what I want.
Right.
All sorts of different things like that. I mean, they know. I mean, if you've ever watched any or researched anything, I'm sure you have, with just the level of detail these social media companies mine data from their consumers, their users.
Yeah.
How much of that is going on relative to political campaigns, to your knowledge? I mean, did you work with any social media companies in that way to kind of like get that data in terms of weighting when you're looking at things like that you were working on?
Yeah. So we never did anything quite down to that level of detail. Mostly, so you're waiting on how likely they are to vote. That's number one. So if you vote in every single election, you're going to get contacted about everything. And if you vote very sporadically and infrequently, they're probably not going to contact you. So that is one of the things they look at. And then, a whole bunch of other factors based on like how partisan you are, how, where you live, whether it's rural or urban. I mean, there's a whole bunch of factors. I was not quite involved. So that like the building of the model of who to contact, I was not involved in. That was the
Sure.
data department. So I was I was up a level. So I do not really have that much insight.
Yeah, just curious if like that was
But-
something that you'd seen in the company.
Yeah.
and,
I mean, I
imagine-
can
yeah,
I
imagine
can
there
tell
has
you
to be
they
to
have
some
extensive
extent.
models for who specifically to target in terms of whether they're targeting you by mail, like I said, or grassroots, or if they're texting you, or, and how likely you are to vote. All of those things, that they do have models for.
Yeah.
And they're pretty dang complicated. And I have not been super privy to them, but if you've ever thought of or heard about, the people like data analysts in normal companies where they say, based on what this, product is targeted, you're going to release a new product and you want to know how much money it's going to make. So you think about what kind of other products you've put out that are similar. You think about cost, you think about who it's being advertised to, all
Sure.
of these things. And then you say, okay, based on all of these factors, I think this is going to make this amount. Right. And that's what you do. And it's almost what you do in politics, but it's a little bit different because it's voters instead of dollars.
Sure. And like the product, obviously that is the candidate and their issues that they're messaging on and things like that.
Exactly. Yeah. And they do message testing, particularly in those big polls in the beginning and sometimes in the smaller brush fire polls where they'll, they know what the candidate's position, generally speaking, is going to be. If it's gun control, they know if they're going to be pro-gun or anti-gun or what have you. And they're probably not a middle ground because almost every like big consulting firm is, being run by one of the two political machines, right? So they're either Republican or Democrat. But they'll do message testing where you phrase it slightly differently, right? And I don't, if anyone's ever like nerding out about polls or wanting to nerd out about polls, phrasing matters a lot, right? If you're like, abortion should be legal in most cases versus illegal in most cases, or if you say abortion should be legal in most cases, or then you say it should be illegal occasionally. You're going to get two different responses to those questions, despite
Mhm.
like them essentially saying the same thing, right? Both of those would apply to like if you wanted a ban at 6 months or something.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of that goes on, and then but that's more messaging impact kind of thing.
Yeah.
So
Interesting. Yeah, I find that the messaging and just the way things are worded, I find that fascinating. Just how powerful that is, and how much, we don't even realize how much just a simple shift in language affects our perception on, our opinions and things that we think we have these like well formulated thoughts on day to day.
Yeah, absolutely. And that would be like one of the takeaways for Forward, who's like trying to build this like middle ground, is it's pretty, especially like once you get into like the more political wings of like left and right wing. I mean,
Mhm.
Forward's never going to appeal to like the far left people or the far right people, like, and that's not even who we're going for.
Sure.
But to
They've
get
got their lanes, they're sticking to them.
yeah, and they're over there, either on the far left side of the highway or far right side of the highway. But you need to be able to reach out in a way to each side, that's not like contradictory, but
Right.
is
Tricky.
yeah, and a lot of that is how you message it, right? So I mean, like if you're like wanting to have, I'm trying to think of a good example, and utterly failing, unfortunately, but if you're wanting to have a moderate position, you need to be able to sell that both to the right and to the left. And Yang was fairly good at this, where he says, this is better than what we have, regardless of which political side you're on. Right.
Sure.
So like his UBI pitch was, if you don't like the welfare state, this is better than the welfare state. If you do like the welfare state, well, then this is, money that we're going to give to everybody. And they're not going to lose it for making slightly more. That system's still going to be there to support them. So,
Yeah, and it's staying away from those polarizing words. It's saying, obviously you could frame UBI as socialism and then no one on the right is going to
right.
touch it. Or
Yeah.
you could also frame it as the government doesn't know how to use your money, so we're
So
going to
they're
get
giving it
rid
to-
of the welfare programs
Exactly.
and spread it out. And that's
Exactly.
the same thing said very differently, but would appeal to these,
Yeah.
these different
So
folks.
that's an excellent example. Obviously didn't work for Yang. He is not president nor mayor of New York City, but that's a good example of messaging.
Sure.
And trying to make sure your message appeals to lots of audiences, not just one.
Absolutely.
So
you we're talking about Forward here. So when did you get involved in politics? Have you always been political? It sounds like this career you really just stumbled into. So when did you start paying attention to politics?
yeah, it is a little bit of stumbling, but also, so like I was politically active in college, and was politically informed in high school. And I mean, like I remember like watching Bush v. Gore when I was in kindergarten, which
Oh, man,
I'm
that's
sure
pretty
just made a
early.
whole bunch of people feel really old. But yeah, I remember that. And I mean, like my mom is very politically involved and active. But so I'm sure, it runs in the family, and her mom was politically active and whatnot. So,
Fair
I mean,
enough.
basically forever I've been involved at least in like thinking about it and talking about it, if not in activism and working in it. So, and it's not that hard a transition if you really want. Once you've made all the contacts and people and all that, I mean, you can end up, I can tell you, they will hire most people to knock doors, right? I mean,
yeah.
as long as you're not like a felon or like, actively have a warrant out for arrest, or like, they're pretty lenient with who they're going to hire for those positions, because they just need people.
Yeah.
And
High
there's not
turnover, like you said.
there's a high turnover. And the other thing is, typically when you need people, it's in the middle of the year and everybody's employed, right? I mean, like there's not that many people who are job searching at any one time, particularly who want to go house to house. So they're pretty willing to give people a try. And then if you're good at it, and you stick around, it's not that hard to get promoted because of the high turnover rate. So, I mean, it was like 1 month between starting canvassing to when I became low level management.
That's
It's
pretty good.
yeah, it's pretty good. So, I mean, like, I can't guarantee that's going to happen to you. Past what do the lawyers always say? past results do not guarantee future outcomes.
Yeah.
But I mean, like you can definitely make a solid job of that and then just move up in the world. And that's there are like, I think I can count on like one hand the number of people who worked at the company I worked at who did not canvas doors at some point. Right.
It's
It
like
is
the
like
rite of passage.
yeah, it's like the gateway drug or rite of passage or however you want to phrase it. That is the number one way to get in. So if you are wanting in, I would recommend that. And then the other thing is, I mean, you get a lot better handle of what the average American really understands about politics, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if you're hanging out in Forward, there's a lot of people who are really involved and have been really involved for a really long time and know a lot of stuff. But I mean, like, you know, I've been to doors where you knock on the door and you're knocking for a primary and you're like, hey, you know, this election's coming up. Just wanted to know if you're going to vote. And they're like, oh, yeah, like, don't worry. I always vote Republican or I always vote Democrat. And you're like, well, this is a primary. Like, everybody's in the same party. And they're like, don't worry. Like, I'm going to vote for the party. And people are not that well informed. Most people. There is like a
Yeah.
very small contingent of people who are mega informed and have like opinions on star voting. Right.
I mean, that's just where it gets so interesting when it comes to things like messaging, where it's like you've got to cut through the noise. You've got to say something in a way that these folks who just aren't paying close enough attention, you know, but they want to vote. They're going to vote. It's their duty as an
Right.
American. And, you know, in order to reach those people, you got to be pretty compelling. You got to give them something that's really going to, you know, get their attention enough to change these patterns that they've had for, you know, X number of years.
Yeah. Absolutely. And yeah, so that's one of the like biggest hurdles is with Forward is like if you can go to the door and you say I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, they'll be like, oh, okay. With Forward, you know, it's a lot of name recognition and just understanding what we're trying to do. And then the other thing is, you know, you go, well, we're wanting to do you know, clean up the electoral system and make like elections run better. And then they're like, okay, well, what does that sound like? And you can't go on a 30-minute tangent about all the various different versions of voting and why first past the post is bad.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Cause
they're gonna close the door and fall asleep.
Right. Oh yeah. That's the trouble. It's like, you know, we know that the electoral reform, I mean, that's our approach. We know that that's
absolutely
we believe that that is the best way to go about, you know, changing the system and go about fixing the issues that we have.
Yeah.
If people haven't heard of it. It's not a very sexy topic, we'll say.
Yeah. Yeah. My opinion, which is not an official Forward opinion, but personal opinion.
But I wanted to preface that with you and I and Cesar Garcia and several others were a part of the first street team.
Correct.
So I didn't realize at that time I was dealing with a professional.
A professional, yes. No, it was funny. Yeah, I went to Rick and he was like, "Oh, do you need any?" I was like, "No, Rick, it's fine. Like I'm totally good." So, but yeah, that street team was fun. We need more people to do street teams. So if you're listening to this podcast and you want to organize one or you want to, you know, just participate, get in contact. It's a good time, especially street teams. You're not going house to house on street teams. You're sort of just standing on a street corner and being like, "Hey, you, like, do you want to hear about electoral reform?" And everyone's like, "No," and you're like, "I know you don't, but I'm coming anyways." Like you just have to, you know, hit it with some good humor, and people are generally pretty fun about it. But
yeah, most people that kind of restored my faith in humanity a little bit. It also just kind of like showed me how just people had a very like, I don't want to say negative, but just it almost was like a negative. You could really tell people were just disillusioned with where the state of politics is.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, and I think the best way to get electoral reform in is, you know, you need to get candidates who can run in the district reasonably. And I mean, like, you know, Texas, Rick went into it at length, is quite gerrymandered. So there's a lot of districts that are very red or very blue, and you just need somebody to run in those districts, but also have electoral reform, you know, that they want to push through. Like that is, you know, and I'm not saying any of the other issues aren't important. A lot of them, almost all of them are very important, but in terms of like trying to get the democracy back to a healthy place so we can solve problems like that, you know, you're going to want electoral reform. And I think one of the best ways Forward can do that is just supporting candidates or putting forward candidates that are going to do, sort of what their constituents want, even if their constituents are a little bit too far right or too far left for, a moderate's taste.
Yeah.
But they do support electoral reform. And that's, I think, the number one path forward. So, I mean, I'm not saying if Marjorie Taylor Greene was in favor of ranked choice voting, Forward should support her. Not saying that, but there's got to be a fine line to walk there. It's tough.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, that makes sense to me. Where it's like, look, it's one step at a time. And that is a concrete step in the direction that we want to go. And that really the majority of these independent, moderate minded organizations like Forward believe is necessary in kind of fixing this mess.
Yeah, for sure.
But I wanted to, wrap up with this. So in your experience, the lessons that you've learned when you were working with this firm, a large part of that was getting out in the community, and a large part of what we need to do and what we're doing as Forward Party right now is building this community. Anything that you feel like you learned in that time that we could apply as a party, both nationally, both statewide, both as individuals, including as individuals, just knocking on doors and volunteering.
Yeah.
Any lessons that you feel like we could apply?
I think the number one thing is going to be that, like, this is, if we're talking about like races, this is like a marathon of like starting a party and like getting everything up and running. Like, this is not like a sprint. So like you need to go in with the understanding that like we're probably not going to win much of anything next election, or even probably the election after that. But like we need to build out like all of this infrastructure. And I mean, like these people are spending, the average house race costs $3 million to run. That's Texas State House. That is not the House of Congress. That is like of the US. We're talking Texas. So, I mean, there is a lot of money and a lot of people and a lot of time on both the Republican and Democratic sides committed to winning for their side. Right. Yeah. And Forward has a lot of really committed people and is working on the money thing. But I mean, like, we don't have all of the infrastructure, right? Rick was talking about, getting it set up so that there's people in every county who are running the party, and getting on the ballot. I mean, like, there's a lot of just things in terms of infrastructure, using that term loosely, that we need to get done. And, you always hear that, but like seeing it firsthand where like everyone has built a PAC and has like all of this crazy political shell money rolling around, and just, all of the connections everybody has. Because like I said, like political's very incestuous. There's a lot going for the other parties in terms of like raw resources that Forward's going to need to overcome one way or the other. And part of that, I think, is going to be on like the main parties not being good. They kind of suck.
Right. We got a good opportunity there for sure.
So that's going to be a huge help, but it's not going to be everything. So, you need to go in with the mentality, and also with like the stamina of understanding that, like, you're going to have to do this for a long time. So like, if you're like going to burn out, don't burn out. Right. Like,
and temper your expectations, temper your,
absolutely
the amount of work as a volunteer you're able to commit if you're working a full-time job, all those things. I think that's very wise.
So yeah, we want you to participate, and it to be a great experience, and the country to be better for it. But you need to be able to do it in a way that you can do it consistently, because the party's going to rely on you, other people are going to rely on you, and all that sort of stuff. So that would be my number one takeaway.
It's a race, not a sprint. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Marathon, not a sprint. Correct.
Here we go. Well, Alex, I don't know about you. I'm not going to be running any sprints or marathons tonight. It's probably beer 30 for me. We always talk about door knocking. I'm a little parched.
Yeah. No, it has that effect on people. So no, for sure. I will maybe also partake in a beer. Probably not. I got a couple plans with the fiance. So
that's all right. That's more important. Definitely.
Yeah.
Anything that you want us to plug, promote, anything that you're involved in right now that you want to give a shout out to?
As you mentioned in the beginning, we have a Texas Discord server. So if you're of the generation that understands how to use that sort of thing, sign right on up. If you're not, you can go to the Forward Party website and sign up for the newsletter or the Texas newsletter or both. And get on those, Zoom calls once a quarter or bi-monthly, or I don't know. I'm sorry, I forget what they're running them, how frequently they're running them currently.
Zoom call once a month. The newsletter is something that we're going to start to see a lot more of. That's something I'm actively working on with the comm team, or the comm team is actually actively working on, which I'm a part of. Not going to be writing the newsletters personally, but that's something we're going to have a lot more of coming out. And Rick has been doing the monthly in Austin monthly meetings, and I think there's a lot of different events going on at any given point in time. So
yeah, for sure.
Well, Alex, thanks very much, man. It's been fun. Glad we got to chat here.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And thanks everybody for listening. We as always want to hear from you. We want to hear what you want for us to talk about on the podcast, who you want us to go after as far as guests, anybody that is in the party like Alex, who's just a kick-ass volunteer, who's got an interesting background to tell us about, and help us all learn something. So we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. See you, Alex.
See you.
All right.